Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. Back today to talk about the first half of my reads for May. May has been a pretty interesting month for reading. I feel like I've had a nice variety of different kinds of books. This being said, I don't particularly feel like there were any big standout books for the month of May, which is a bit of a shame, but it is always nice to vary up my reading. So without much further ado, let's just get straight into these books. The first book that I finished in the month of May was Innocent Traitor by Alison Weir. You'll have previously seen that I have read Alison Weir's Six Tudor Queens series, her recent Tudor Roses series, her two fiction offerings on Elizabeth I, as well as Eleanor of Aquitaine, and I realised that I was only 2 books short of finishing off her backlist. She actually has since published a new book featuring Cardinal Wolsey, so I am still to read that, but in the month of May I did manage to check off the last 2 of Alison Weir's backlist books, and as I say, the first one of those was Innocent Traitor. This was actually her first novel, and looks at the life of Lady Jane Grey, who is known to history as the 9 Days Queen. This goes from her childhood all the way through to her execution, featuring her very fraught relationships with her family, her childhood growing up with Elizabeth I, being educated by Catherine Parr, the potential betrothal of Jane to Edward, which eventually would go nowhere, her eventual political marriage to Guildford Dudley, and then the various forces at work, including her parents, who tried to arrange her ascending to the throne as a Protestant queen to oust the Catholic Mary I, and her eventual downfall. In this book, Alison Weir is really depicting a girl who has been used and abused by the people around her, being used as a political pawn. Despite all of her intelligence, she really has very little agency, and it is very, very devastating to read. You can kind of tell from this book that this is Alison Weir's first novel, which is most evident in the fact that this is written through multiple perspectives rather than just Lady Jane Grey herself, and each of those perspectives are told in first person, whereas now when Alison Weir writes from the Tudor court, it is from a singular perspective, the woman in question, and it is told in third person, and I feel like that just works a little bit better. Definitely an interesting read, and she had a very tragic life. I just feel like there is a lot more richness in her other books. I feel like she's really developed as a writer of fiction, and I do tend to prefer her later works to this one. Following on from that, I also picked up A Dangerous Inheritance by Alison Weir. Once again, a slightly different type of historical fiction for Alison Weir from her previous books, in that this is actually a dual perspective and a dual timeline. Anyone who's participating in the historical fiction readathon, this could definitely check off your prompt for that. The first line taking place during the Wars of the Roses and following Kate Plantagenet, who was the bastard child of Richard III. The second timeline taking place in the 1540s, 1550s, and looking at Catherine Grey, who was actually the sister of Lady Jane Grey. So reading these two straight on from each other definitely helped. And I would definitely say that you wouldn't want to read this one without having read Innocent Traitor first, because I feel like this book gives you a much richer understanding of the Grey family. We see Catherine Grey living in the shadow of her sister, her reaction to the downfall of her family, eventually seeing Elizabeth I come to the throne. The majority of her plot lines are actually focused around her love life, and particularly the scandalous nature of her love life, and how that put her in a very tenuous position, eventually being placed in the Tower of London. With Kate Plantagenet, we then see a parallel story mirrored back to us. Though for the longest time while I was reading this, it didn't feel altogether clear why it was that these two characters were being intertwined, why they were both being brought together into one book. It does for the longest time feel like 2 separate stories, and eventually it does come to light, the similarities in their lives, but I will say even with that, the connections seem tenuous at best. With Kate Plantagenet, we are seeing a more sympathetic portrayal than you often get for Richard III, seen through a daughter's eyes who only wants to see the best version of him, but after he loses at the Battle of Bosworth, is killed, and then his throne is taken over by Henry Tudor, she is mentally having to fight against all of these conflicting narratives, all of these people telling her that her father was a bad person, and she doesn't want to believe it. She is distrusted because of her loyalty to her father, which puts her in conflict with the new regime, and she herself ends up spending time in the Tower of London. And eventually both Kates, while they are in the Tower of London, set out to try and work out the mystery of the princes in the tower, a mystery that to this day has never been fully solved. With Kate Plantagenet, it's very clear why she would want to do this. She wants to clear her father's name. In the case of Catherine Grey, it is slightly less clear, aside from she's just a bit bored and wants something to work on while she's in the tower. Once again, it didn't really contribute to feeling like there was a real connection between these two girls, aside from the fact that they had scandalous love lives. And all in all, while they are both interesting to learn about, lesser known figures from their respective courts, I ultimately felt like this was the weakest of Alison Weir's books. Definitely one that I'm glad that I read, but only really for completionists. Following on from the Alison Weir, I picked up the Geographers Map to Romance by India Holton. I've previously read her Wisteria Society series, which I quite liked. It's a fantastical romance. The word I always use for them is that they are very zany, and that carries through into this series, which I believe is the Love's Academic series. Though I will say, from the 2 that I've read of this series so far, I definitely like it a lot less. This particular particular offering follows two professors, Elodie and Gabriel Tarrant, who were wed in a marriage of convenience a year prior, but who have since been estranged. They are brought back together following a magical disaster that occurred in Wales, both of them wanting to solve this mystery of what happened, using their knowledge of magic and geography. And as you can imagine for a romance, over the course of this story, they are brought back together after very many hijinks and whimsical scenarios. And the word that I have to describe this book is, it's just a bit ridiculous, to be honest. The mission that they are going on to Wales is unclear. India Holton's style is to write something that is historical, romantic, but also has this magical element. And this mix of geography and magic was just overall a bit baffling. I didn't understand this magic system whatsoever. And you're reading the dialogue between these two geographers, and it feels like they are just saying meaningless words that nobody in the audience understands because they are this blend of geography and magic. And I don't think you're meant to, so why are they taking up so much of the page? I also could have done with fewer digs at humanities students, thank you. I feel like the thing that you go to India Holton's books for is definitely the main romance, and the side characters typically you just either take or leave, but the side characters in this book were more ridiculous than ever before. They don't add anything to the story. They are just nuisances who get in the way. One thing that was nice reading this particular India Holton romance compared to her previous books is that these two characters are married. They did consummate their relationship a year prior, so that felt like a fresh new dynamic for India Holton. You know, you don't have these two who are kind of tiptoeing around each other, being like, oh, I wonder what he'd be like to kiss, because they know already. However, despite the fact that these two are very, very clearly still in love with each other, it takes 70% of the way through the book for them to actually do anything about it, which in comparison to previous India Holton books is much, much slower. And it didn't need to take that long for them to admit their feelings. And I wish that somebody had been there to edit out like half of the, oh, does he like me? Does she like me? Oh, I'm not sure. Oh, clearly the fact that they kissed me twice in 2 days was a mistake and they didn't actually mean it. It is just kind of baffling. And it doesn't really ring as true for these two to be dithering over their feelings for each other. By the end of this particular book, it just read less like a published romance novel and more like really bad fan fiction. And I am specifying bad fan fiction because there is some very good fan fiction out there. And this wasn't it. Next up, I went over to poetry for the first time in a while, and I read Alexa, What Is There to Know About Love by Brian Bilston. I'm familiar with Brian Bilston because a colleague in my office is quite a big fan. She'll often post different poems of his. He's known for being fairly quirky and inventive, often referencing modern technology, being quite satirical, and as you might imagine from this book, the main focus is love, different versions of love, the ways that love have evolved over centuries or even millennia, as seen by the very first poem, The Caveman's Lament. Me think about her when sun rises. Me think about her when sun sets. Me say to her how much me love her. She tell me, love invent not yet. You can tell from that it's very playful. It's not taking itself too seriously. The one that I think is the most popular of Brian Bilston's is the to-do list. Delay, defer, equivocate, make some tea, procrastinate, look at Twitter, stroke the cat, readjust the thermostat. Dawdle, dither, hem and haw, fill the kettle, chew my jaw. Write 9 words, spin on a chair, play 6 games of solitaire, observe the merry dappled light dancing on the page of white, review my words, paper scrunch, stroke the cat, break for lunch. Prioritise new tasks to shirk, ponder changing world of work, look at Twitter, spin on chair, make a brew, loiter, stare. Check out last night cricket score, reorganise the kitchen drawer. Write 9 words, cross 6 out, stroke the cat, stroke self-doubt. Make tea, stroke cat, cricket, stare, Twitter, chair spin, solitaire. Stroke cat, make tea, twicket, wallow, write to-do list for tomorrow. I feel like my best advice for Brian Bilston is to look at his Instagram, look at his Twitter, and you'll probably get a judge for yourself whether or not this is kind of a playfulness that you can stomach. I feel like for me, it was like every other poem I quite enjoyed and got a little bit of amusement out of, and the rest of it I was thinking, okay, that was a poem, I guess. I feel like what the draw is for Brian Bilston is how relatable. It's the kind of poetry that you read and think, oh, I could have done that. And then you think, oh, but I didn't. This guy did. It makes it feel effortless and easy, but it probably is anything but. And it's a good one for when you are just wanting to laugh at the absurdity of the world. The last book for this section of the wrap-up that I read was Heatwave by Penelope Lively. I actually picked this up in Stratford-upon-Avon when I went there with my mum at the beginning of the month for the very reason that when I opened the book, the first line was, "It is an afternoon in early May." And when I picked this book up, it was indeed an afternoon in early May. I didn't know anything about this book aside from that first line and the beautiful sunflowers on the cover. And with that very shallow reason to pick up a book, I went ahead and did so. This book is set in the English countryside in the 1990s, and we are following Pauline, who is 55 years old, who works as a freelance copy editor and is living in her second home in rural Oxfordshire, getting work done there for the summer. Her daughter Teresa is in the house next door, as well as her son-in-law Morris and their child and Pauline's grandson Luke. And through the course of this summer, Pauline can't help noticing seeing the breakdown in the relationship between Teresa and Maurice, and she can't help observing similar marital patterns between Teresa and Maurice as were in her relationship, which had eventually culminated in Pauline's husband cheating on her and them eventually divorcing. And Pauline feels powerless as she sees what is inevitably going to happen between Teresa and her husband. And as the temperatures rise over the summer, so does that feeling of tension. And does she step forward and try to do something about it, or at the very least, tell Teresa of her doubts? Is it her place to do so? What do you do when you feel like you are seeing your child repeat your mistakes? Do you intervene, or do you just let them play out? This is a really quiet, unassuming book, which then leads to quite a dramatic, explosive ending, which did take me unawares. For the majority of the book, you do feel like nothing is really happening, but you also feel that loss of control. You feel the stifling atmosphere, you feel Pauline's frustration, but because you've been led down this path of feeling like nothing is going to happen, when things do eventually bubble over, it feels quite jarring. Definitely not one if you are looking for a pacey book, but if you are looking for more of a character study, if you're wanting something to go along with your own Heatwave, and you don't mind a slightly quieter pace, then this could definitely be an interesting book for you. So there we go, those are all of the books that I'm going to talk about in this half of the wrap up. Do let me know if you've read any of the books I've spoken about today. Alternatively, please let me know about anything you picked up in May and really enjoyed. I would love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.